Well, welcome everyone to a special YouTube presentation featuring my good friend and colleague, Professor Zev Garber, coming to us via Zoom from Los Angeles, California. Professor Garber is, without question, one of the most prominent and well-regarded Jewish scholars alive today, and we're fortunate enough to have him with us to address a subject that's really at the heart not only of Judaism, but also the words of the historical Jesus, at least according to the New Testament narrative, namely the so-called Great Commandment. We read in Matthew chapter 22, an expert in the law tested him, that is Jesus, with this question: "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Well, Jesus' reference is obviously to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 5, though the passage starts in verse 4, Deuteronomy 6:4, which is the key declaration in the Jewish faith to this day. And to underscore that, I'm going to share my screen here and illustrate what we're talking about. Here is a reproduction of one section of a scroll of the Torah, the books of Moses. Happens to be the book of Deuteronomy as it is read in synagogues to this day. And we're looking at Deuteronomy 6:4, Shema. That's our word in Hebrew, Shema. Hear, it's an imperative. Shema, Yisrael, hear, O Israel, Hashem, and here are those four Hebrew letters that comprise the divine name of God, Yud, He, Vav, He, corresponding to YHWH. We do not pronounce those, even when reading the Torah, even to this day. And as I read it, I simply say Hashem, the name, implied the name of God. Hear, O Israel, the name. Elokeinu, our God, the Lord our God. And here's the word again, the four letters. Hashem, Echad, one. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And what do we notice about the text itself? That the last letter of the first word, Shema, here, the letter Ayin in Hebrew, is writ large. And the last letter of the word in Hebrew for one, the word one, Echad, the Hebrew letter Dalet, is also writ large. And what happens when we take the Ayin, the large Ayin, and combine it with the large Dalet, we get this word, Ed. And you see them illustrated here. Ed is the Hebrew word which means witness, as in a testimony, the central witness and testimony of the Jewish faith. This is it. This single verse nails it in terms of what Judaism is and represents, the oneness of God. And immediately thereafter, we have the beginning of the passage, which Jesus of Nazareth, the historical Jesus of Nazareth, is said to quote, Ve'ahavta, and you shall love, the imperative tense again. Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, you shall love the Lord your God, bechol levavcha, bechol nafshecha, bechol meodecha, with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength or might. And I want to share one more image here before moving forward of a fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have in this incredible ancient library, the Dead Sea Scrolls, dating back to around 200 before the Common Era. That's how ancient these parchments are. We have among the scrolls at least fragments of each and every book of the Hebrew Bible, with the possible exception of the book of Esther. That's the only one that is not represented. And this just happens to be a fragment from the book of Deuteronomy. Dead Sea Scroll. And you may think that this is total gibberish, but we have highlighted, if you know any Hebrew at all, we have highlighted Deuteronomy 6:4, and I put the more modern Hebrew scroll beneath it. If you happen to know some Hebrew, you can read the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the Shin, the Mem, the Ayin, Shema. And this word, very difficult to decipher, but just barely you can see Yisrael, hear, O Israel. Here is the Tetragrammaton, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, plain as Hebrew day, corresponding to the modern scrolls we see below. We call them modern. And here is the word our God, Elokeinu, and then we have the Tetragrammaton again, the 4 letters, Tetragrammaton, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, and here's that word Echad, one. That's just by way of background. And with that, I'm going to leave it to Professor Garber to pick it up there. But before turning it over to Zev, I'd like to share a few more words about him. He's Emeritus Professor and Chair of Jewish Studies and Philosophy at Los Angeles Valley College and has served as Visiting Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California at Riverside. Visiting Rosenthal Professor of Judaic Studies at Case Western Reserve University and is President of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew. He's Emeritus Professor of Shofar and founding editor of Shofar Supplements in Jewish Studies and the Studies in the Shoah series. He has presented and or written hundreds of articles and reviews, academic and popular, in the areas of Judaica, Shoah, that is Holocaust, Jewish Jesus, interfaith dialogue, and he has authored and edited 15 academic books. Having said all that, let's get your perspective, Zev, on the Great Commandment, beginning with the Hebrew Bible itself.
Right, Ken, first of all, thank you so much for your wonderful introduction. As Ken introduces, a hell of a lot is found in his words, and I'm always impressed whenever he introduces a topic. There's a lot that's there. Having said that, I'm also going to follow what's called rabbinic tradition. Rabbinic tradition has an opinion, and then there's a counter opinion. That's all it is. It's one position, a second position, and how to resolve those two positions is the third position, you might say. I heard Ken's introduction, and he made reference to Tetragrammaton as the Yud Hey Vav Hey, the word by scholars as Yahweh, a word that's not pronounced by Ken when he reads those words, and would say Shema Yisrael, Hashem, Hashem. The Hashem word, in my opinion, is possible when you talk secularly. When you talk in religious terminology, such as a classroom in a yeshiva, a parochial school, it is not out of place to use the word Adonai if the reference needs it. And certainly in synagogue service, to my knowledge, I know of no synagogue that will read the word Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, if it's part of the actual ritual of the synagogue itself. So in religious context, to my understanding, rabbinic tradition has usurped the sacred name and suggested that we do give a sound to it. And that name is the word Adonai. That Adonai word, which admittedly is not the 4 letters originally, but somehow has come in as a substitute, particularly in Sancta, for the 4-letter name after the Babylonian exile of roughly 587, 586, when Jew exiled and returned back in 539. Just a comment, but the comment itself deals with how a name is pronounced and whether you can substitute another name, because this, I think, is part of how one can read the Great Commandment as it's so called. Let me perhaps read from the New Testament itself, the synoptic version of what's called the Great Commandment. The Great Commandment is found in 3 places, literally parallel 1:1:1, but there's a difference in the version found in Matthew, Mark, and also Luke. John, the so-called 4th gospel, is not a synoptic gospel, which means seen together, but totally independent. And I might add that Ken and I are both editing now a whole new monograph on anti-Semitism, just that term itself, in the gospel according to John. For example, in the Gospel of John, there are 72 references to the word Jew or Judaism. and 71 of the 72 are seen to be extremely negative. Only one is seen to be positive. How is this possible? How to interpret the negativity by the word Jew? How much more so when Jesus at the cross is said to have the title, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, and yet that word Jew is totally condemned, extremely so, in the Gospel according to John. This is what scholars deal with. You get a text, you see the text, and now you try to interpret. So, for example, well, before I get to the Shema itself, let me just look at the three versions for a moment, then we'll get back to it, of the so-called Great Commandment in the Gospels. The first Gospel, let me go in order now, is the Gospel according to Mark. Not the first one listed in the New Testament, where you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John, but according to scholarship, Mark, a Gentile, I might add, is said to be the first composer, or the school of Mark, of what you call now, of what's now called the books of the synoptics of the New Testament. Mark is a non-Jew. Keep that reference in mind. The text I have in front of me has scribes come up and hear him basically, or hear them actually asking questions, and basically ask him, meaning Jesus, which commandment is the first of all. When a statement is said, first of all, if you follow logic, the first commandment has nothing to do with the Shema. The first commandment is in the book of Genesis. The first commandment is Peru Uruvu, be fruitful, multiply. That be fruitful and multiply ends with the Adam and Eve generations in what is referred to in biblical narrative as the Mabul, the flood story. Everybody is wiped out. And then you have the story of Noah and his three sons. And again, we have that phrase, be fruitful and multiply. How desperate is the absence of male, female in that so-called narrative? I'm not sure, but I do know that the three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, see their father sleeping, and one of them says, I need to have a fruit or something of that nature. And according to one reading, actually cohabits with the sleeping father, Noah, and so the tradition of the curse of Ham and the Hamites later in history. One of the people is Egypt. Another people is a group called Put or Libya. And so it goes on from that which happens later in history, read back to that which happens before, and a strange story that the youngest son knew his father. When you have the actual reference of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Ham is the middle son, not the youngest son. So how's that possible? And before you know it, you'll have the Yavan, that is to say, the Greeks, and they, together with the Hebrews, share that land, and that's seen later in history to be Philistine or Rome or Greek, and the Hebrews are the Israelites. This is how stories are told. You see a name, you interpret it from your generation, read it all the way back to a previous generation in order to have a certain type of authenticity. But the first commandment has nothing to do with hero Israel, nor do you have the first of the 10 commandments have to do with hero Israel. So what is meant by first commandment needs to be interpreted. And the interpretation is it means importance, the significance of that particular commandment. How significant is a statement called the Shema? It's basically said when a child comes into this world. It's basically said in morning prayer and in evening prayer, twice in the morning prayer, the Shacharit, and once in evening service. It's also become a strong tradition to be the very last Hebrew words or sentence a person says, cognizant that death is knocking on the door. I even tried to say that verse when I was under a doctor's knife last March. They didn't give me a total injection. I was totally awake when they did a a battery change in my don't even know the term anymore. But anyway, I felt the pain, and all I can do is say the Shema, but I never completed it, knowing full well I'm making a joke here. Not making a joke at all. I was in pain, and that's the first thing that comes to my mind. It's about time you learn how to say the Shema on that particular moment. This is not a game. It's taken extremely seriously, and I'm going to raise that question with Jesus as well. So back to our readings of the New Testament. It is from Mark himself where you'll have the answer, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And as Ken implied, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your heart to see, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. Notice what Mark basically says. Love the Lord your God, and then goes on with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. That word mind is not found in the Deuteronomic version of the Shema, as you'll hear me read in a couple of minutes. Question, where does Mark come up with the word mind if it's not quote unquote found in the original Shema in Deuteronomy? Second point, Mark is a Gentile. Last week's dissertation or presentation by me, I made it very clear the whole question of the notion of the sacredness of Israel and Am Yisrael, separate from other nations, not superior, not inferior, but different. What scholarship simply calls the monolatry. Monolatry is a belief in a singular God by a singular people. Monolatry is not monotheism. Monotheism is a universal command, as it were, or universal belief in a singular God by all peoples. That is not the original Israelite religion. I try to show that with references to the word El, Elim, God, and gods, other terminology that is found in the Hebrew Bible that we associate with the God of Israel, but originally comes from Mesopotamian and from foreign cultures. You pick up a term, you eventually depaganize that term and become synonymous with your term to such a degree, you therefore think it's your term from the very beginning. Not so goes scholarship, nor goes my method of understanding the Torah. The Torah is a gathering point of a number of cultures and then reworked again to eventually become down as the Jewish position, even though originally, factually, it never was that way. So keep in mind, Mark the Gentile says, Hear, O Israel. Mark is said to have been composed around the year 70, right at that definitive moment of the destruction of the Second Temple and what eventually becomes the grain of the exile of the Jews from the land of Israel. I now take a look at Matthew. Matthew chapter 22 is important for only one basic reason. It is seen as the Jewish gospel. Mark is the Gentile version, and Matthew is Jewish. Well, in the case of the Matthew version, the question is asked again, teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus responds, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with your mind. It then goes on, this is the great and first commandment, and then you shall love your neighbors yourself. Well, Matthew has something missing here. The first thing that's missing is Hear, O Israel. Why does Matthew not have Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one? Is he that dumb that he doesn't know his basic Hebrew lesson? It's totally missing. A counter argument will say, well, why should he have to say the Shema? Because he's a Jew, you understand? And Jews take it for granted. So he doesn't have to specifically say that. But it is necessary, particularly if you're going to be a light unto the nations, to borrow the phrase from Isaiah. It's missing. And then if you look at the ingredients of what that love is all about, you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And then it says with all your mind. What about the phrase found in Mark, which has with all your strength? Mark has strength after mind. Strength is missing in Matthew. May I suggest why? If Matthew indeed is part of the Jewish peoplehood, not borrowed into it, but part of it, it's very conceivable in the year 90 that he's going to revise that Shema paragraph. With all your strength, Israel doesn't have strength anymore. Israel lost that revolution. Israel is just several decades away from total exile. Maybe Matthew is giving us a patriotic, a nationalistic response. Strength, we don't have it anymore. We lost the war. Or maybe this is Matthew's way of suggesting why Israel is a Jewish nation, for him is not at all possible. And so the reference of Jesus as sense of a new Messiah, a new Redeemer, a new way to exalt the Jewish people. I don't know. I do know that word is missing. I now go over to Luke. Luke basically has a lawyer asking the questions. Mark has scribes asking the questions, and Matthew has the Jewish guys asking, called the Pharisees, meaning the rabbinic type of thinking. Regarding Luke, a non-Jew, I might add, the question is asked and he responds without saying the Shema Yisrael, but he does go on, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and then adds the word mind as the fourth ingredient. What is interesting about Luke is that he has the right order of the Shema. Admittedly, he doesn't have hero Israel. Why so? Because Luke is not a Jew. Luke is a Gentile. Gentiles know that the Shema Yisrael refers to Israel, the peoplehood. Later in history, that word Israel becomes a spiritualized term for everybody, meaning Christians in this case, but not back then. So Luke is proper. He doesn't say hero Israel, but he does say what is found under that dictum is okay for us as well. And he has the right order with the final word mind. The question now is, where does this word mind come from? And what's so significant about it? And why is it missing in the Shema, as I'm now about to read from the Hebrew text? The text of the Shema is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. What makes that text interesting is the location where it's found. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, what you have is the second version or another version of the so-called Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments is first found in Exodus chapter 19, but chapter 20. And in chapter 19, by the way, the Israelites are called a Goy Kadosh. That word Goy, Gentile, it means nothing more than nation. Israel is referred to by the term Goy, a separate nation, meaning by its traits, by its behavior, by its beliefs, they are separate from other nations, as every nation can make that same type of claim by virtue of their traditions. That's important. The word Goy is not a derogatory term. It means a people. And when you say Am Yisrael, that means that people called Israel has a togetherness about it. The word Am has the same spelling as the word together. Jews make that claim. They have a certain unity about how they see the world, feel about the world, even though that could be disputed. But that's what you'll get in the word Am. Am is togetherness. Goy means simply a people. United States of America today is a Goy. At one time, one nation under God. You can argue maybe we were an Am, the people of America. Get it? Use the American reference and use the disputation of how united or disunited we are here. And you got the difference between Goy and the word Am. Am means unity. In the Ten Commandments found in Deuteronomy chapter 5, you have one of the commandments that differs from the commandments found in Exodus. I'm looking at sentence number 12 of Deuteronomy chapter 5, where the English has observed the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In the Exodus version, it's not observed. It's not observed, but rather remember. Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. That's what it says in Exodus. And the reason given is the 6 days of creation, the seventh day, the Lord rests, and that's that. In this version here, which has the injunction observed, we're told not so much the story of the creation of the world. We are told the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The Exodus, Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's the emphasis in the second version of the Ten Commandments. Once you talk Exodus, you're not talking humanity. You talk days of creation, that's humankind. You talk the Exodus, that's specifically a reference to Jews and their experience. I find this fascinating because in chapter 5, at the very beginning there, you have God revealing the laws, the statutes, etc., to those of us who are standing here today and to the generations that yet will be born. And in this particular version of the Ten Commandments, sentence number 4 of Deuteronomy 5, Panim b'fanim diber Hashem imachem. Face into face did the Lord speak to you. Face to face is impossible. Moses, our great teacher, basically could not see God face to face. He saw the back of God, to use the imaging. Here you have face into face, suggesting that God is not distant. God is in your face. He's in your face. And he's not talking to the ancient fathers, our patriarchs and our matriarchs. He's talking to us standing here today and those yet to be born. And all this is linked with one historical event: slavery and freedom. Remember that. That's the foundation of the Jewish people. That's when God is face to face. And in every generation, God speaks to us face to face as these type of events of anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism, slavery that way. And how do you want to deal with it? God's in your face. Do something. And keep in mind the two terms, the Lord and God, where one means justice and the other one means mercy. With justice preceding mercy, that is how the terminology should be understood. Now the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. What Ken did was to show you the abbreviation or the capitalization of the last letter of the Shema and the last letter of the word one. Ken and I did not talk at all about what we're going to say. This is Garber writing right before I go on a computer here. I have that word, v'achafta, that verb that means you are to love. The reacha, I point with vowels, is your neighbor. And then this deals already with the love your neighbor yourself. I'll get to that later. But here's your Shema. The Shema with the last letter capital Ayin and the last letter of the word one capital Dalet. Why the capitalization? First of all, let's get the facts down. It is literally absent with all words of the 5 books of Moses to have capital letters. You don't have periods in the written Torah. You don't have question marks. You don't have semicolons or colons. This already is your printed Bible, you might say. You don't even have vowels. And so when you take a look at the capital I and the capital Dalet, what you have here is a scribal tradition. The question is, why these 2 letters? Here is where interpretation comes in. This is nothing more than how rabbis or the rabbinic sages of old basically did their homework. They saw a problem, and the problem therefore had to be resolved. I have another blackboard, which I don't know where I placed now, but all right, the problem had to be resolved. And what you see is a textual problem. It shows a problem in itself, and now you begin to interpret it. The peshat, the remez, is the hint there's something wrong here, and the drash is interpretation. And so the interpretation of the ayin and the dalet together spell the word aid, a witness. As you say the Shema, you are basically being a witness to what that concept is all about. But there's another reason. And I shared that with Ken the other day. I, among other accomplishments in my young life, it's really a senior life now, visited with the Samaritans. I interviewed them. I wrote one of my first articles on the Samaritan Passover back in the 1970s, published at the Hebrew College Journal of Religion. And what exactly am I referring to? My informant, his name is Itamar. I hope he's still among the living. I asked Itamar to record for me with my little recorder various prayers. I asked him, could you please recite to me the Shema? Itamar's Samaritan Hebrew had the phrase Shema Yisrael. Shema. Shema, to my Jewish Israeli ear, is perhaps not here. Shema. When he says it, the Samaritan Hebrew, it means here. When I hear it, the Ashkenazi ear hears perhaps. It may well be that the purpose of the Shema is the reason why the Shema is purposely emphasized, because the last letter of that word is a laryngeal letter. It is a silent letter, so much so when you see it in Hebrew, you don't give a sound to it anymore, unless you come from a good Yemenite Arabic-speaking background. In Arabic, they have a sound for it. Hebrew does not. And Sephardic Jews don't have it anymore either. And what about the word echad? Echad, when you write your Hebrew, those letters don't look the way you see them today. And it's very possible that the letter Daled looks like the letter Resh. One is the word D, one is the sound of an R. And if you read the resh in that word, you'll read not echad, but you read acher. Keep in mind, Hebrew is written without vowels. You don't have vowels under these letters. So that may also be a reason. The ayin for the purpose of perhaps versus here, and the resh at the end of this word here is basically to make sure you read it as one rather than the word another. Just theories, but they're as good as any that can be offered. Do you now write the letters with small letters? No, the tradition has already set it in. And now let's take a look at the original Shema. It is different than the one found in the New Testament, to which we have to respond to why. As I read the text itself, you are to love the Lord your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. The word ma'od means very, like in the phrase tov ma'od, very good. Well, where does might come in? I'm reading an English translation that says might. I don't see the word very at all. I'm not reading a New Testament here. And then you begin to investigate. That word ma'od may have some kind of connection with the word koach, which means strength. So I'll grant that with all your strength, whereas the Hebrew word ma'od does not imply that at all. And with all your heart and with all your soul. Well, where's the word mind? Mind is significant in Mark. Mind is found after these three words in Luke. And I guess you need to interpret the word with all your heart. Heart is not just simply an organ that beats after you die. After death, it's possible your heart is still beating. The heart, I guess, is what we call today with all your feelings, with all your emotions, with all your love. Heart back then is the thinking process. Where the blood kicks in, the blood kicks out. It's very possible that the word heart is the thinking process back then. And by the time of the first Christian century, the word heart is now understood where the thinking occurs. So you use the word mind. This is my way of giving credit to the word mind because it implies what that word heart is all about, a thinking process. So the Israelite writes with all your heart. He's also thinking about how you think. I'm just giving a hypothetical here. But Mark and Matthew and Luke do not drop the word heart. And then it says here, with all your soul. Nobody defines soul. I will define it for you. Soul is the life animating principle. When you're dead, soul is over with. Jews have a word called neshama. That translates also soul. Jews have a word called ruach, which means spirit. Jews have a word called nefesh, which is called soul. The soul in English may embrace three different Hebrew words. What it means, nefesh, is life animating principle. When life comes in, the nefesh is there. When life expires, no more nefesh. That's how you interpret. So you have the Shema so affirmed. This is part of the Great Commandment. But keep in mind, you have an additional phrase by the Jews. If you read the Shema itself, it has more than that. And these words which I command you shall be upon your heart, meaning on your thinking process. And then you are to teach it to your children. You're to speak to it when you get up in the morning and when you go to sleep at night. And it goes on, it should be also a sign upon your hands. A sign upon your hands and the frontlets between your eyes, and you are to write them on the mezuzot, on the doorposts of your homes and on your gates. The Shema is not just simply an affirmation of a credo. It's also an act. You say and now act. Otherwise, don't say it. And your action shows the Shema when you go to sleep, when you get up. Shows the Shema as part of your garment on the head and on the hand. The tefillin. Shows the Shema when you enter your home, when you leave your home. The mezuzah, the doorpost. This is the power of the Shema. What you have here are basically a declaration that God is one. What you have here is a statement that God is one is your monotheism, a statement of Hero Israel. You also have an act that's done, a teaching that's done as well. And that was what makes up the Shema. Now, as I get to the Jesus concept right now, keep in mind a tradition found by Jews. When Jews say the Shema, they don't have to stand. They will sit and they will go back and forth and they will take their hand and they will go like this. They wave it out, they wave it in. They wave it out, they wave it in. They close their eyes and they begin to say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. I gave you the Shema in good Ashkenazi Hebrew from the shtetl that my father comes from, somewhere in Ukraine called Zvil. You wave your hand, you close your eyes. You wave your hand, you close your eyes. As you wave your hand, it looks like go away. As you go like that, it means come close. It doesn't mean that at all, but that's the impression that comes across when someone sees a Jew say the Shema, and he moves back and forth. Keep that image in mind. We now move over to the second of the so-called Great Commandment, of which the phrase has it. I'm reading from the New Testament again, whereby you have, right after the Shema, looking at Luke now, and your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself, is then followed, and which you mind. And then it says your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't even say love your neighbor, according to Mark, according to Luke. But as I take a look at Mark, the second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Mark is very explicit. The second meaning of the Great Commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. I'm looking at Luke right now. Luke only has with all your mind, and then says, and your neighbor as yourself. So Luke is missing, you shall love your neighbor. It's implied. Regarding Matthew, who's said to be the Jewish background, you basically have, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, he has it as well. And a second of the Great Commandment, says Matthew, is like it, like you love your Lord, your God. You shall love your neighbors yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets, suggesting, as it were, you don't need 613 observances and beliefs. All you have are two, and now go and carry out love of God and love of neighbor. There is a problem with this love your neighbor as yourself. At 9:30 this morning, a half an hour before I go on this computer, I get a phone call. I am told in good American English, you have an authorized purchase from Amazon of close to $2,000 dealing with some kind of phone, something like that. If you're disputing it, call the following number. I know what's going on. I called the number, I can recognize the voice in the other hand. I said, stop scamming people. Before I can continue, that phone hangs up. You have to love your neighbor as yourself. You have to turn the other cheek. I have a hard time in my everyday life to fulfill what seems to be a non-judgmental call. Furthermore, love your neighbor as yourself implies v'achavta et recha. You are to love your neighbor. I want you to see some Hebrew before I read from Leviticus chapter 19. That word recha is your neighbor. That word achavta is the same phrase used, love the Lord your God, and now love your neighbor. And now these two markers, this marker of an aleph tav is the word et. Et is a Hebrew feature. It's a sign of a direct object. It has no comparison or equivalent in English. English doesn't have the word et. And when you translate from English to Hebrew, if you see a direct object, which is a definite direct object, then you precede that word with the word et. And as Ken told me the other day, a lot of Israelis don't use that anymore. They don't bother to use that. It's just irrelevant for them. That's the problem. It may be irrelevant, but does the text have it or doesn't it have it? The lamed, on the other hand, is a preposition that means to, for, of. And now watch your English. Love your neighbor. Hebrew would not have love your neighbor. It has love to your neighbor or love to a neighbor, love of a neighbor. It separates love and the neighbor from a direct object. It's indirect object. Very important. Indirect does not mean directly. Indirect means you go in a circle. And maybe the indirect object is to imply you're not able to love a neighbor directly. Nobody is. Do unto another what you want done to you. Isn't that on the mouth of Jesus as a so-called golden rule or something of that nature? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Do unto your neighbor as you want done to you. Who's making the judgment call here? You are. And what might be satisfactory to you may not be satisfactory to me. And what I think is beautiful, and I want you to have it as well, may not be at all acceptable by you. It's a question of subjectivity and objectivity. The other phrase would be, don't do to someone what you don't want done to you, and that's it. At least you're not doing something that could be harmful. Whereas the first statement, which is positive, you're doing something which you believe is beneficial, but not necessarily so. That is the difference. So when I take a look at the original version of love your neighbor as yourself, it is found in Leviticus chapter 19, I believe. And let me look at it with you as I have my Pentateuch in front of me. And I'm going to read the text itself. Let's hope I've got the right place. I've got chapter 19 here, in which you have these particular words. Okay. Chapter 19 has a number of statements and of behavior patterns. So, for example, I read sentence number 16 of the third book of the Hebrew Bible, Leviticus chapter 19. You shall not go up and down. Well, let me read some of this first. You shall not go up and down as a talebearer among your people. You know what that means? You're not to be a person who causes problems by being a talebearer, by being a gossiper, by being an exposer. Don't do that to your people. Don't talk to the government about your people. Wow, this is really sacred. Don't be a talebearer. That's what I'm reading here. Among your people. Keep in mind it says among your people. Neither shall you stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You can't be a tale person. You cannot be a gossiper, nor do you stand idly by the blood of your people. You see a riot somewhere in New York City, you get yourself involved. Oh, wow, it's not my person. I'm not going to get involved. After all, he's a Hasidic Jew or she's a black girl. That's wrong. You get involved. You don't say Jew, Muslim, irrelevant. You're going to take this love your neighbors yourself seriously? Then what about moments of exposing? And what about situations of helping? Shouldn't that be followed as well? I continue. You shall not hate your brother in your hearts. Again, in your heart, in your feelings, in your thinking. Don't hate your brother. Brother here, I guess, also means sister. Do not hate. Hate is a taboo. You shall not, says here, you shall not surely rebuke your neighbor. And goes on here, and not bow and not bear sin because of him. And then it goes on, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You don't talebear. You don't bear vengeance. You don't do anything negative. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, the word reacha does not mean Gentiles. What? Love your neighbor. Neighbor means a member of the tribe. What? See how strange that is? I'm reading the text in context. Don't take vengeance against your brother. That doesn't say the nations. It says your brother, a member of the tribe. And you better believe that criticism has been hurled against the Jews. If that is so, then what about Jesus saying that very same verse found in the New Testament? And finally, for my fellow Jews, stop worrying about what I just said. At the very end of this chapter, you have the following statements. You are to love the stranger as yourself, and a stranger that sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. The stranger that sojourns with you shall be unto you as a homeborn among you, and you shall love him as yourself. Let's get this clearly understood. When it says love your neighbor, and use the word recha, it means a member of the peoplehood. I'll grant that. But the chapter ends with one other lesson. The stranger that dwells with you. The word ger, stranger, is from the Hebrew word to live. You are to do likewise. Anybody in your land. And the reason given, because you were strangers, slaves in Egypt. I told you 15 minutes ago that that the slavery before Cherut. This is the second version of the Ten Commandments. This is God face to face. In Egypt's 400-year slavery goes one theory. What do you think? You guys lived by yourselves? You had Egyptians who took care of you. You had the midwives of Moses said to have been Egyptian women. Get it? On a Passover Seder, you pour some wine out of that cup of yours when you say the 10 plagues. God doesn't forget. You don't forget. The stranger is why the Jewish people are who they are. Don't ever forget that. If it weren't for the stranger, the Jews would not be around. If it weren't for the Gentile women, you would not have a Jewish people. And let me tell you another secret. The Gerim among us, those who choose Judaism, live a Judaism, the likes of which a born Jew can't even reach. Don't you ever put them down. They're superior to you. The motherhood of the Jewish nation happened to be Gentiles. Even in Islam, I'm told, a favorite wife of the Prophet Muhammad was a Jewish girl. That's it. Labels are what they are. It's how you carry out the action. And let me end with one last thought. It's how you carry out the action is how the rest of us can see how you believe. You can believe beautiful words, say great words, but there's no action. The words, what's just that? And when you do your action and you're asked why you do what you do, have a great defense. Love of God, and God is seen through our actions. Love of neighbor, because one time or another, that stranger, that neighbor will save our lives. Reward before that happens.
Zev, that is so powerful as usual, insightful, profound, don't have words. We can all, who are fortunate enough to be watching this YouTube broadcast, we could all listen to you for many hours, and I hope we shall in the future as well. It's a wonderful experience. I wanted to interject something that I find rather interesting about what you brought up, showing the difference between the et and the lamed. Normally we would say ve'ahavta et, or in modern Hebrew, ani ohev et, I love, and then whomever it is. Or ani ohev et haTorah, I love the Torah. Et is the sign, the mark of the direct object. So why does it not say ve'ahavta et re'echa kamocha? Why does it not say you shall love et, the direct object, your neighbor, as yourself? And it says ve'ahavta la. And as you mentioned, it's an indirect suggestion or sense here. But it's interesting. I did a little research, and there are only a very few places in the Hebrew scriptures where we find that particular construction. For example, la'azor la is another place we find something similar, to help. Okay, we have Leviticus 19, loving the stranger as oneself, but it says in 1 Kings chapter 5 that Hiram always loved David, and it uses the same lamed there. Not et David, but le David. What does that mean? It's as if he is helping, doing something to help David. 2 Chronicles 18, where the prophet says to Jehoshaphat, the king, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Question mark. Obviously, love there means help. The first phrase, should you help the wicked and help those who hate the Lord, or love those who hate the Lord? The construction there clearly means help, even though it uses the word ahav, love. All right. So the idea is that one should be helpful to one's neighbor. One should do something for one's neighbor as it would be done to you. And I find it very interesting that there's kind of a midrash here in Luke's telling, after Jesus makes this statement, this declaration. Of course, the Shema itself is missing, but he says, you shall love the Lord, you shall love your neighbor, i.e. help your neighbor. And what do we have immediately following that but the parable of the Good Samaritan, where a man is going down from Jerusalem down to Jericho. He's just been up in the holy city. And what happens? He's beset by thieves who rob him and strip him and leave him for dead. And who comes along but a priest who gives him a wide berth? And a Levite comes and pays no attention to him because they've already been in Jerusalem. They've already been clean and cleansed and purified. And what if the man is lying dead in the road? The last thing they want to do is to defile themselves by contact with a corpse. But who comes along but a despised Samaritan who does what? Who helps that man, who does everything possible, who clothes him, who takes him to the inn, who pays for him. And it's amazing because if you could put yourself back in that environment where Jesus is actually telling this story, it's a very rabbinic type story. Who are the people expecting to be the hero? Probably a Pharisee, because there is in Talmud, as you know, the law of the goses, the dying person, that if a person, if you know that a person is dying or about to die, then you are obligated to do whatever you can to help that person, even paying that person's bill, taking on power of attorney, as it were. The crowd expects the hero of the parable to be a Pharisee following oral law, oral Torah, Pharisee law. And who is it? A Samaritan. Jesus pulls a fast one on them because the Samaritan is one considered not a member of the tribe, but an enemy. An enemy, a despised Samaritan, becomes most ironically the hero of the story because he acts as a Pharisee would without even being a Jew, without even knowing or understanding oral law or the law of the goses. He does it anyway. And that's the beauty of it. So basically, we have a parable told by Jesus in order to explain what love means. In the Western mind, and I love that you also bring up that the word mind seems to explain the word heart, because the thoughts take place in the heart. But in the Western mind, what is love anyway? If you ask any person on the street what love is, or Prince Charles, for example, whatever love means, right? What does it always boil down to? A feeling, an emotion, a sense, something in the heart, or as it were, in the mind, something you think about. But to the Jew, love is a behavior. Love is an action. Love is what you do. It's the ve'ahavta la re'echa kamocha.
Ken, let me pick up on this. First of all, thank you for the additional information, which is very enlightening for me, and I trust for everybody. But you also remind me, I referenced something earlier, and now with your presentation or offering, let me get back to it, meaning the waving of the hand when you say the Shema. There is a point I've said in a number of lectures I've given publicly in my classroom, as certainly and elsewhere, and that is that Shema Yisrael and why it is absent at the crucifixion of Jesus. There are all kinds of interpretations I choose to develop regarding it. It could well be that Jesus could not understand what the Shema is. It can well be that by saying the Shema, such as at the crucifixion, is a clear sign of what is expected of an observant, obedient Jew to say upon death. And maybe, just maybe, Jesus is Jesus with a mission to accomplish, has not really finished that mission, and so will not say the Shema, and death comes before he's even able to reconsider and say the Shema. I have all kinds of explanations. I have one also that the death of Jesus at the cross is done not by the Romans, they're simply an instrument. But God, as God is God, needs to execute Jesus. This is based on what critical scholars call a Jesuolatry. Jesus as a instrument. Jesus is meant to bring us to participate in the Godhead, but never to replace the Godhead. And since it got that close of stepping into, representing, pointing to, and now replacing, God as God had to kill Jesus, had to basically put him to death. So in a strange way, God's involvement with the execution of Jesus, like God's involvement with the Shoah of the Jewish people, is not absent. It's there, and how to deal with this terrible understanding of God in the face of evil to his people. There are several statements in the Bible where God repents of the evil he said he would do to his people, such as the golden calf story and Moses challenging God, should you not permit the people to live? You made those promises to the patriarchs, and God repents. God repents. That's the language that's found in the Hebrew Bible. But there's another explanation, and this goes very well with the separation of Jesus and the Jewish people. So it is understood. My point is, Jesus never separated willingly or willfully. His disciples made sure that he did. And so 2,000 years, what's called supersessionism, now being reconsidered since 1964, 65 with Vatican Council II. And everybody who's a believing Christian and practicing in dialogue is now on board to somehow do teshuvah, return back from the errors of so much anti-Jewish slander over the centuries. I read this somewhere. I wish I can find the source. There is a whole history of Jesus stories called Toldot Yeshu. It basically represents polemics. It represents a Jew attack and getting back at his attacker. The stories are not pleasant at all. They are vile, if you want to see some of them that way. No different than how Jews are portrayed, like in the Gospel of John, with 70, 71 anti-Jewish statements. Boom, 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 boom. That's what you do when you fight your enemy. You use words, and the narratives are what contains them. The story I read was January 1st. I remember specifically the day, several years ago, written by the Sephardic rabbi, the Sephardic synagogue, Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York City, a historical synagogue, by the way. It was from his article of January 1st being the 8th day from December 25th, and Mazel Tov. It is the circumcision day of Jesus. That's what January 1st represents in the Catholic Church. It's the day of the circumcision. It's a day of obligation. But the story he told is incredible. You see, Jesus was a simple boy. Jesus comes from a family of Mary and Joseph. And if Joseph is not the father of Jesus, then for God's sakes, whose sperm is Jesus carrying? Is it a Roman conqueror? According to one of the Toldot Yeshu stories, it is. Does Mary have an affair? Heaven forbid you don't talk this way. But that's what comes out. Jesus, however he comes into this world, wants to be the Rabbi Jesus that he's now referred to, a teacher. And what you have him do is you have him go to a yeshiva, a place of learning, and he's learning like any young boy would learn. He comes from the Galilee, he's not from Jerusalem. He doesn't understand traditions. He's told that the main rabbi there is going to spend a weekend in an aksanya. Aksanya is a nice Aramaic word, which means an inn, probably with Greek influence. Aksanya to the ears of this young boy, Jesus from the Galilee, sounds like a place of prostitution. He hears his teacher telling everybody he's going to spend a few days in an aksanya, in a place of prostitution, says the child Jesus or the student Jesus. He approaches the rabbi. Rabbi, you cannot do this. He screams at him. The rabbi says, quiet, like this, quiet. Jesus is not going to have on his watch, his master go to a house of prostitution. It's the same house, by the way, that Joshua and his spies spent a few days in, according to the book of Joshua. Rachav. Only Jesus is determined to stop this. And he enters the next morning to find the rabbi davening, praying, and saying the Shema. Right that very moment when the Shema is being said, Jesus runs to the master. The master is busy doing this. And for Jesus, doing this means go away, go away, go away. I'm saying the Shema. Jesus does not understand the gesture. He interprets it as rejection. Once, twice, 3 times. And ain't that interesting? 3 waves of the hand. And Jesus is broken. May this be the reason why the Shema is not said by Jesus. The Shema is the oneness of God. What we Christians have done to Jesus is to make him part of that oneness. I'm not one with God. I've been rejected by God. Ladies and gentlemen, you've now been inaugurated into a Garber Midrash. The rejection of Jesus is what the Shema is about. One God, not 3, that's 1. But that's philosophy. It's a young boy wanting to be and being told you're not accepted without realizing he was not rejected. Let that be the momentum of this hour. Don't ever feel rejected. The more you get pushed away, the more you come back. And you know what? When you have Jewish weddings, when you have anything, a conversion to Judaism, you come the first time, out of here. Come the second time, out of here. The third time you come knocking, not only are you not out of here, you're dragged in. That's the message. 3 times is permanent. Once, twice, you can debate it.
That's the message. That's the message. Thanks again so much, Zev. Very powerful stuff. And we're just delighted to have you on behalf of the Judaic Studies program of the University of Central Florida. It's a real pleasure. My students, thank you in advance. And we will certainly be seeing you again online, on YouTube, and perhaps someday at an academic conference, God willing, face to face, panim el panim. As we say in Hebrew, kadima.
Good evening, everybody. Be well, everyone.
Bye-bye.